Hello, welcome back to another of our video segments, one of the last of our course, Journalism in a Pandemic, covering COVID-19 now and in the future. Now we're talking about the world from here. And one of the most important questions in that is, what do the social and economic impacts of COVID-19 look from this point on? To explore that, we're going to speak right now to Felipe Lopez-Calva. He is the Regional Director of the United Nations Development Program and an Assistant United Nations Secretary General. Director Lopez-Calva, thank you so much for joining this course.
No, thank you for the invitation.
So the first thing I'd like to ask is just, can you tell us, what are the main socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 that have been perceived or recorded to this point?
Okay, I think it is large heterogeneity across regions. So the first thing I would say is that, as you know, the control of the pandemic, because of the uncertainty in terms of the magnitude and where the main hotspots are in terms of contagion, that leads to a complete lockdown in many cases. Certainly in the Latin American region, in Europe, in many cases, there has been very strict measures of lockdown, which, as Nobel Prize economist Paul Krugman said, it's like putting the economy in an induced coma. So in a way, you're basically shutting everything down so people can stay at home and you can identify where the hotspots are and try to control the pandemic. So the health emergency basically becomes the most important element, and then you basically stop the economy. So how does that affect people, as you are asking? So certainly the economy contracts, but it depends on what groups of population. But in many cases, what happens is the whole expenditure is contracted. So businesses start to have liquidity problems. They cannot pay salaries. Eventually, they have to fire people. So the whole economic fiber, let's say, or the economic structure starts to be harmed. So people concretely start to losing jobs, start to stop getting wages, and some of them have savings to deal with it, but many of them don't. So there are large population groups that are hit very harshly by this situation, certainly mainly middle income and low income countries where, for example, we don't have unemployment insurance, or we have very limited mechanisms to protect these people. So governments are reactive, but even with that reaction to try to transfer income and so on to people, the main first level impact has to do with monetary poverty. So we have in Latin America, if you take national poverty lines, close to 30 million people are predicted to fall back into poverty after a period of poverty reduction for 15 years. You have, if you look at very, very low levels, like with what the World Bank calls extreme poverty, which is $1.9 per day per person, which is a very low monetary poverty line. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, will have close to 24 million people falling into that level of extreme poverty. So that I would call it the main first round impact of the pandemic. Of course, then you look into education. So education systems are also shut down. In many cases, you can do it through these online technologies like we're doing, but in many countries, groups of population don't have access to this type of mechanism. So it's having a second round. I would emphasize impact is large hit on the capacity of individuals, kids, young people to continue in the schooling. And this, of course, eventually can be recovered, not at a low cost, but many people predict that it will lead to dropouts. People, children, young people get discouraged and they may actually drop out. So we still don't know exactly, but I think the second large impact is going to be on education, human capital for societies. And of course, eventually, if we start to look into bankruptcies and firms not having the capacity to pay their loans and so on, we're going to see also potentially a big hit on the financial sector. So, these are just three aspects of perhaps some others, but three very important aspects in which the pandemic is really hitting the economies and the individuals very harshly.
I really appreciate your going into such detail with that. Thank you very much. As you look at these impacts that you just outlined, do you see any one particular impact hitting any one region of the world more or less? Are there places where small businesses have been chilled more versus flow of capital versus trade, perhaps?
Well, in terms of, according to World Bank predictions, in terms of poverty increase, certainly Africa is being hit. I would say that in terms of economic impact, as we see, Europe is impacted, not with such a large effect on poverty because they have mechanisms to protect people, such as unemployment insurance, also in the US. But I would make a point for middle-income countries, and in that sense, the region where I work, Latin America and the Caribbean, is mainly a region with what we call middle-income countries. Mm-hmm. However, this is also a region that has not been able to consolidate middle-class societies. So we should not, make an analogy between being middle-income country and having a strong middle class. Actually, these are middle-income countries with large sectors of population that are vulnerable because there is large informality, because there is a lot of people that depend on the daily capacity to go out and generate some income. And also, middle-income countries are not eligible for concessional financing, for example. So in a way, all the responses, the banks, for example, the response that the IMF and the World Bank has put together to try to provide debt relief to countries is mainly focused on low-income countries and less developed countries, but they cannot apply to middle-income countries. So middle-income countries are responding to all these effects that I mentioned before, trying to protect people, to transfer cash to people, to protect firms by giving lines of credit, provide liquidity, all these aspects that are having an impact on their fiscal capacity without having that relief in terms of access to funding. So what we foresee is a very serious fiscal situation for this large group of countries in the middle income range, because they will definitely be running out of capacity to respond because of the fiscal space. So I would argue that in terms of the macro situation, middle income countries will be harshly hit, particularly if this crisis lasts a long time. And in the very short term, I would say that regions with large levels of informality and incapacity to react, like in the cases I said, Sub-Saharan Africa, are having an impact on the poverty level of people.
So it's really fascinating to me what you're saying about the degree to which a national economy can be made up of essentially informal earners, and how much of a country's, I suppose, GDP that represents, and how much that means if people are informal earners, they are not registered in any way with any kind of national system that might attempt to create even a one-time safety net. Are there any more complexities in that? I don't know if you've been told, but we have students from more than 160 countries in this course, almost 10,000 students at this point, I believe. And so many of them certainly are coming from countries where informal earnings, informal income structures are very important.
Certainly. I think one of the structural aspects that will correlate very strongly with the impact of this crisis is going to be the large size of the informal sector. So what does that mean? That means that, in Latin America, there is heterogeneity. The lowest level would be, let's say, Uruguay, with levels between 25-30% of the labor force in informality. but you go up to levels like 60 or 70% of the labor force being informal. That means they work in very small firms with very low productivity levels that are not registered, as you said. That means that these people, the workers in these firms, do not have access to basic health protection, social protection, pension, and all these elements first. Second, these firms are not contributing in most cases because they are not registered to the fiscal capacity of the state. So that creates also very weak states from the fiscal perspective. So the capacity to react is also lower. But this also involves self-employed people, sort of freelance, let's say, people who are, plumbers, construction workers, from that all the way to professionals that are also self-employed, and in many cases they are not registered either. So they don't have these mechanisms to protect themselves from the shock unless they have savings, which is not precisely the most common situation, particularly for those in lower levels of income. So that level of informality is very important. But in that context of informality, I want to stress women are overrepresented, which means basically because of the lack of care facilities provided by public sector and because of the lack of a system that supports the care sector, many women do not have the flexibility to work full-time or to work in registered firms. So women are particularly overrepresented in this informality or very highly vulnerable jobs. And in that sense, women become a highly vulnerable group in terms of the economic impact of this crisis.
I really appreciate that analysis with regard to gender. Thank you so much. It's so important for us to keep in mind as we look at the future of the next few years that the burdens of this are falling unequally, not just on nations and on types of earners, but on people within families and within societies as well. I want to ask, is there anything you can say at this point about balancing the risks of, obviously there's economic devastation with cooling economies, and yet that seemed necessary in order to keep the disease from spreading. How does one start to think about beginning to open economies up again and balancing that risk against the need to get money flowing?
So there is a lot of discussion in the public sphere about the trade-off between lives and livelihoods. So the idea is rather you protect lives or you protect livelihoods. And I think the extent of that trade-off really depends on the capacity of the economies and societies to provide these things. One is large-scale testing, because that is very important to really know and how to more carefully identify the hotspots and not having to shut down the whole economy. If you can really test in a systematic manner, you can be more strategic about where to shut down. The second, and of course that relates also to the capacity of the health systems per se. If there was no constraint in terms of the capacity of the health systems, we will have a lot more margin with this pandemic. The second element is the fiscal capacity of the governments, as I mentioned before. To what extent you can actually support firms, support individuals through fiscal mechanisms, so you can actually deal with the crisis, control the health elements, and then reopen. But the other is the capacity, as you said, to reopen strategically and determine and enforce standards of safety. So what are those sectors? I can tell you, for example, a recent government I was discussing with in Latin America, and in the Office of the President, the Strategic Affairs Office of the President, they have a very sophisticated dashboard where they have which sectors provide more employment and more value added to the economy. And also in the other axis, they have the risk in terms of contagion. And they are starting to reopen the economy, very carefully looking into those that have high impact in terms of the economic recovery, but also that relatively low risk. And the idea is what kind of standards you establish to try to reopen. For example, if you go into construction that is in an open space, infrastructure, for example, that is in an open space that you can relatively easy to establish standards and to control people that go in and out of the construction site. Well, maybe you can open that kind of sector with all those controls, but maybe in entertainment or movie theaters, malls are more complicated because these are areas of contagion or sources of contagion potentially, and they could really create a new wave of contagion. So that you have to be more careful. So this thinking carefully which sectors and under which standards you can reopen is very important to try to balance this idea, to try to recover the economic dynamic without trying to run into the risk of a new wave of contagion. So this is not easy. You require capacity of the governments. And this is one element, for example, in which we as the United Nations Development Program try to support government with other multilateral organizations and colleagues who try to bring expertise. So we have, for example, a very good a recent agreement with an organization called Grand Data that uses all the mobility devices. I mean, for example, they use cell phones and other type of devices to try to anonymously, of course, identify groups of people and the level of mobility in different areas of the city. So we're trying to use this type of data to provide advice to governments to see where the lockdown is being more effective, where the mobility can be can be relaxed. So this is one element that we have. So the use of technology to enforce the mobility restrictions, or the production of knowledge. So there's a gap of knowledge. So we try to, we have our policy documents that are being produced really, very rapidly to try to provide government with advice and knowledge on how to analyze and respond to this crisis. So there's a lot of need, a great need for capacity in terms of knowledge, in terms of finance, in terms of implementation capacity of the government. To the extent that you can close those gaps, you can reopen the economy with lower levels of risk.
So we've been talking about how low and middle income countries are at a disadvantage because of the structure of their earning sectors, because of their relative lack of capital. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether there are any ways in which the low and middle income countries may be less disadvantaged in this crisis. For instance, we've been talking about how in areas where tuberculosis is still extant, everyone knows how to do contact tracing. That is not a skill that has vanished from the culture in the way that it has in the United States, for instance. And there are countries that may have economic leverage because they are the sites of pharmaceutical manufacturing or testing sites, even though those sites are owned by the first world. Any more thoughts along those lines?
Well, in the first case, in general, I would say there could be some advantage. For example, even within a country, you may think, and it's actually the case in many concrete contexts, that the rural sector is less exposed, and maybe the rural economy can continue to work because it's not so dependent on agglomeration and large level, high levels of agglomeration. So rural sectors, for example, could be more protected, and maybe you can reopen the rural sector faster. And these tend to be more rural-based economies, which are associated to relatively low-income countries, could be seen as less affected, and it is actually an objective criterion. But I think overall, the net effect of being poor in this crisis is not playing out as a positive thing, particularly because it interacts with the other constraints that I mentioned before, the lack of capacity of governments, the lack of finance. So at the end, being lower income in this crisis, even though it has perhaps some advantages like the ones you mentioned, is overall is not turning out to be an advantage. And it will require a lot of support. And within a country also, low-income, more vulnerable groups will require really very proactive response from governments. Otherwise, this crisis will deepen already existing inequalities. We have mentioned all these shocks into different groups of that are affecting different groups of population. But we have to acknowledge that pre-crisis, there were also many structural problems. So this crisis is only exacerbating these structural problems. It's not the main cause of many of these problems, but it's actually the interaction of this shock with previously existing structural inequalities, patterns of exclusion, low levels of productivity, and weak financial situation of the government. So all this is just being exacerbated. And for example, when we talk about education, the inequality is very clear. Those who are poorer have less access to this type of technology, so they have less access to continuing education. So in some cases, we are considering all technologies, in a way, if we can call it that way, like television or even radio, to try to continue the education for certain groups that cannot have access to this type of connectivity. So these type of solutions are required, even though they would look like completely from the past. Now they are becoming a way to try to overcome these inequalities and try to reduce the impact of the crisis. But certainly we're gonna see a deepening of these inequalities. And I think part of the policy response should be to try to move into a recovery that, rather than deepening this, try to create a new normality that is more inclusive. But that's not an easy, I mean, there are no easy solutions for that.
So let me ask you finally, as societies inevitably begin to reopen because economies cannot be chilled this long, what will the indicators be that you are looking for that will tell you that social and economic concerns are being adequately balanced?
Well, the first is a requirement in terms of, as I mentioned before, looking at what sectors can have a higher, as we call it in economic, the multiplier, in terms of being engines of recovery faster. Balance that, or controlling that for the level of risk. So this is a very important element. So we can carefully have objective indicators of sectors that can be engines of recovery with relatively low levels of risk. I mentioned infrastructure construction, for example, or maybe rural sectors in a specific type of activities. So if we can have clarity on those sectors and try to reopen those, that can have an effect on the recovery without increasing disproportionately the risk. And then try to monitor carefully the situation, try to, of course, at the same time, we're trying to create mechanisms for safety. Like in Colombia, I should say, UNDP supported a project to create these masks that can be used by people to be relatively less exposed to a potential contagion in specific sectors, and these masks are being now produced more, massively, and they could be a possibility. So there are also these elements that can make the return to work safer, while we see a medical solution to the medical problem, this health problem, and eventually we hope there will be a medical solution to this health problem. But in the meantime, we need to definitely balance, I would say, these two elements: the economic impact of sectors that can have higher multiplier, but controlling for the levels of risk. And certainly what we cannot forget, and we cannot give up on, protecting very proactively vulnerable groups. I was telling you, women in the informal sector, vulnerable groups that have less capacity to generate income in these conditions. They don't have access to unemployment insurance or to a salary. So you have to maintain their capacity to, not to go into deeper levels of poverty. So maintaining this very clear focus on supporting these populations, in some cases, people who are not poor and normally would not be eligible for these type of programs, but you don't want them to fall into poverty. So you need to support them. And I would insist on firms and businesses so they don't fall into bankruptcy, and then you don't destroy the economic basis for recovery. Because the more businesses go bankrupt and employment is destroyed, the more difficult it will be to go back to an economic normality, the longer it will take. So you also need to protect that type of employment. And all this requires, again, funding. And in that sense is that I think the international community can be very important in supporting particularly poor countries, so we can have a relatively less harmful effect. In any case, as we know it, this will be definitely seen as the hardest economic times in a century.
A lot to think about, so many strands to draw together. Director Lopez-Calva, we're so grateful for you coming to our course and sharing your wisdom on behalf of all our students from around the world. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for the opportunity.